We are in hockey's dead season. That doesn't mean Locked On Oilers doesn't have you covered. On today's edition, 20 questions about the Edmonton Oilers, where they've been, where they're going, and a whole lot of hypotheticals.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
To this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming fall will be my fourth season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network. I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered, the Edmonton Oilers, every single day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, I wrote down a list of 20 questions on my note sheet on my iPad here, and they cover a variety of topics: recent transactions, draft picks, long-term trajectory, history, and I have 20 of them, and this is a 30-minute show, so I'm going to do my best to be concise and precise in my answers and my descriptions. So without further ado, and they're in no particular order, so if you want to bounce around, the timestamps will be down in the description, and we're going to hit on a ton of topics. So the first question I have: what do you think is more important for the Oilers right now? Getting a first-line caliber winger or a first pair left-handed defenseman? And this is supposing that Matthias Ekholm and Zach Hyman are both going to show signs of age-related decline. I'm not saying useless, I'm not saying totally ineffective, but I am assuming that Matthias Ekholm going forward is probably going to be more of a second-pair guy than a first-pair guy. And Zach Hyman, as good as I still think Zach Hyman is, coming off a serious injury, getting into his mid-30s, I think there's a reasonable argument age-related decline is on the horizon. If I had to pick, I think the answer is undoubtedly another 30-goal winger. I think you could never have enough goal scoring. And look, as much as I love an elite defenseman, you know, if you could drop a Forsling or a Slavin to complement Evan Bouchard, sure. But I think for the most part, I would much rather have the 30 goal scoring winger. I think you throw a good 30 goal guy on a line with McDavid or Draisaitl, they might be able to become a 40 goal guy. And that's something the Oilers desperately need, especially when you think about all of the uncertainty in this lineup right now. They're going to be asking guys like Savoie, like Ike Howard, like frankly Vasily Podkolzin to do stuff they just haven't done before at the NHL level. So question number 2, who is the worst goalie you could win the Stanley Cup with? And I asked this question partly in jest because Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard have combined to be pretty mediocre, outright bad goalies, and the Oilers have managed to get to the Stanley Cup final. You go and look at, say, the last handful of seasons. You go look, let's say the last 4 years of hockey seasons, you go on like Evolving Wild, which is what I have open right now, and you sort it by goals saved above expected. And the top of the list is pretty recurring. I think realistically, the cutoff point is about the 17th or 18th best goalie in the world. I think someone like Darcy Kemper in a perfect situation could win the Stanley Cup. I think someone like Logan Thompson, who was the backup in Vegas that year, he got hurt. Ultimately, they went on and won with the work of it. This is terrible radio. I'm drawing a blank. Aiden Hill, excuse me. That was really embarrassing. I couldn't think of Aiden Hill's name. But yeah, I think anything worse than that, you're rolling with a tandem goalie. I think you do need at least an upper half of the league goalie to win the whole thing, but you don't need an elite one. You know, Bobrovsky is one of the better goalies. I would say he's top 10. Colorado winning the cup with Darcy Kemper. I think Kemper is probably in the mid-teens if I had to talk about it purely on a talent and production basis. So I think you need to get a tier better. I don't think you need an elite goalie, but, you know, even though Freddie Anderson's old, you know, I think Freddie Anderson could win a Stanley Cup in the right situation. Next up, what is Chris Knoblauch's biggest weakness as a coach? I think it's his unwillingness to change things, especially when it comes to McDavid and Draisaitl. And look, I understand deferring to your best players. They're great. They can call the shots to some degree. But the insistence on playing Corey Perry with them in the Stanley Cup final, Perry just didn't have the wheels. They were struggling to get plays going. They were struggling to get the puck to dirty areas. They needed Podkolzin up there. Frankly, they could have used Evander Kane up there, and I do think Chris Knoblauch needs to be more willing to try things out and occasionally tell McDavid and Draisaitl, no, I think we need more of this on this line. Trust me, I got you. Next up, and this is a fun one. Who has more goals next year? Evander Kane by himself or Ike Howard, Matthew Savoie, and Vasily Podkolzin combined? I think I am going to pencil Ike Howard for 10 to 15 goals. I think I'm going to pencil Savoie for 5 to 10. That puts us somewhere in 15 to 20. And then if you throw in Podkolzin for another, let's say 10 ambitiously, that's 30. I think Evander Kane will finish somewhere between 20 and 30. I think there's a world where if he's riding in the Vancouver top 6, I could very easily see Evander Kane getting a good shooting luck year and pushing that 30 goal threshold for the first time in a couple seasons. I think that's perfectly within reason, but I do think this is the baseline. This is the aggregate for the Oilers to try and recreate, those 25, 30 goals. You could relatively routinely pencil Evander Kane in for as annoying of a person as he is, annoying of a hockey player as he can be. He scores goals, and goal scorers stay in the NHL in spite of that. Goal scoring is the most valuable asset in the sport. The more goals you score, the more likely teams are going to be to forgive your indiscretions and give you money, frankly. Goal scorers and offensive contributions are what get paid. Okay. This next one is very similar to one we answered before. What is more important, an elite third-line center or an elite fourth defenseman? Now, this is one where I think a fourth defenseman, on the depth chart, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think a fourth defenseman can be very useful. I think, frankly, you get an elite defenseman in that spot, someone a little overqualified. You think about what the Panthers were able to do with Nico Mikkola in that spot. I think a Nico Mikkola has a lot more impact. And look, Anton Lundell is overqualified to be a third-line center, but I think you look at recent NHL history, you think about maybe Yanni Gourde, Tampa Bay, when they went back-to-back, obviously Lundell for Florida. The Avalanche were a little overqualified with Kadri playing as a supporting role. Around on most teams who would have been higher up. But I think the fourth defenseman probably adds a little more weight because they're going to play penalty kill too. They're going to play more minutes per game than a third line center who has, I won't say limited impact, but definitely a smaller impact. Okay. The last question for our opening segment, and we are not doing great on time, so I'm very curious to see how I manage this in the following two segments. But next up, who would have helped out more if they panned out? Jesse Puljujarvi or Kyler Yamamoto? I think it's Puljujarvi. I think if the Oilers have a Vasily Nichushkin type power forward in their top 6, someone who can chip in 50 to 60 points while being a dominant two-way player, I think that does wonders for this group. And I think it also has the byproduct, the trickle-down effect, if you will, that if Puljujarvi pans out, the Oilers aren't as skittish about playing younger players in more prominent roles. And I think, frankly, Yamamoto, who is still hanging around at the NHL level, he's had a couple cups of coffee with some other teams. I think the path to Puljujarvi becoming Vasily Nichushkin adjacent, or even maybe a Capo Kakko caliber player where he could be 40, 50 points, really good two-way player, I think that would have made a world of difference for an Oilers team that just doesn't have a lot of diversity in its offensive skill sets when you look through the lineup. It's a lot of guys who are good at the same one or two things, whereas someone like Puljujarvi, if he works out, it's a little bit more of a cycle game. It's a little bit more of a shot suppression game in the defensive discipline, and that's something the Oilers really kind of need. Okay, we can squeeze in one more because I answered that relatively concisely. Does Taylor Hall reach MVP caliber play staying in Edmonton? The answer is no. If Taylor Hall had a season good enough to win the Hart Trophy, the votes would have undoubtedly been split between Taylor Hall, Connor McDavid, and Leon Draisaitl. Just the nature of the way teams are. I think when you have 2 or 3 players who produce at a Hart Trophy caliber level, I think you really do run the risk of vote splitting. I don't think that's what did Leon in this year. I think the voters were very in on Connor Hellebuck, the goalie, winning the MVP, but it does happen from time to time. So it's something to keep in mind. We're going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, talk about some bigger picture questions. Who's the next Oiler to get their number retired? What's more likely, the Oilers win the Stanley Cup or miss the playoffs altogether? The best draft pick, the worst draft pick? There is so much more to get to. Be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we got your team covered every day. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, the WNBA, or high-stakes soccer, FanDuel's the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not spice things up and make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the action while your friends are getting sunburnt out at the beach. FanDuel makes it so easy to stay in the action, whether you're getting your bet in before the game starts or after the game starts with live betting. FanDuel makes it so easy. FanDuel pays out quick and fast. And most of all, if you are a new FanDuel customer, if you bet $5, you can win $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. One more time, all you got to do, bet $5, win your bet, $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. So I was teasing a little bit what we were going to do while I was on vacation, what the episodes were going to be. And over the last few days, I've come to the conclusion that we are going to do the best Edmonton Oilers team we can assemble of the Connor McDavid era that is cap compliant. Now, we will pick a reasonable number. We won't do the 95.5 the salary cap's going to be this upcoming season, because that's not competitive. That's not sporting, if you will. We will pick a lower number, probably in the high 70s or low 80s, and we will pick specific iterations of players for each of these spots. They need to make sense. We're not going to play Taylor Hall on the fourth line. We're not going to play Oscar Klefbom on the third pair. We are very obviously not going to start Calvin Pickard. So that's what the plan is for late next week into the following week. So just wanted to give you guys a little bit of an announcement, because it's a fun idea. It's a good episode. So coming up next, the next question, I should say, not first, the biggest miss in terms of contracts. And this is an easy one, and it flows very nicely into the next question I have. The biggest miss contract-wise is very obviously Darnell Nurse. And the question I have off of that, would the Oilers have given Darnell Nurse that contract if Oscar Klefbom never gets hurt? And I think the answer is no. I think if Oscar Klefbom is giving them reasonable first-pair defensive work, and look, he's never going to be a great point guy, Klefbom. He's never going to be 50, 60. He's never going to be in that Bouchard caliber of offensive defenseman. But if he is giving you high-end defensive results, contributing 30 to 40 points, playing first-pair minutes, I think there's no world in which you would commit $9.25 million to a second-pair defenseman. I just don't think that's sound economic policy in assembling a roster. And I do think that's really one of the real points of delineation in this team's window of contention. Next up after that, who's the next Oiler to get their number retired? Probably Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, because I assume he'll retire before McDavid and or Draisaitl. I think McDavid and Draisaitl certainly will. I think Evan Bouchard is going to have a pretty good chance if everything stays the course. I think Darnell Nurse, if he rides out the entirety of that contract, will probably have a reasonable chance. But other than that, this is a very, I won't say spare parts, but definitely a lot of in and out pieces in and out year over year. I think you have your franchise icons. This is one of the league's iconic franchises. You don't want to make that worth less by retiring guys who don't deserve it. So that's definitely something I would keep in mind there. Next up, and this is a fun one to dissect a little bit, and I'm checking off my check marks here on my note sheet. That's what I'm leaning forward for. What's more likely for 2025-2026? The Edmonton Oilers win the Stanley Cup or miss the playoffs altogether? It's miss the playoffs altogether. And I will tell you very straight up, I think just based on game theory, if we are going to lay out the paths, the way the Oilers need to get there, what they need to go right, I think you are talking about a very, very difficult path. And look, we know that. The Stanley Cup is the hardest trophy to win in all of sports for a reason. I think winning the Stanley Cup after the last two seasons would genuinely be maybe the most impressive thing in the NHL in the 21st century. Like, I know that sounds hyperbolic, but you think about the work to get there, the team, frankly, the talent that's on this roster, it's definitely not of the caliber of last year's or the year prior for that matter. And when you think about the journey to just get to the Cup final for a third straight year, let alone actually going all the way, the playoffs, all you need is one of McDavid or Draisaitl be hurt for like a month, and you're going to be in real deep trouble really quickly. So I think in terms of likelihood, it's missed the playoffs, but I do very much expect the Oilers to make the playoffs and win at least one round, if not two, depending on the way the matchups shake out, depending on the way the seeding shakes out. So that's definitely something to keep in the back of your mind. I'm not saying the sky is falling or the Oilers are doomed, but this is all very fragile. And of course, every team in the NHL has to contend with injuries. They have to figure out how to balance injuries, how to manage, how to have guys step up, fill in gaps. So definitely something worth considering there as well. We're at reasonable pace. We're up to question number 13. We're a little under halfway through. So we're doing okay on time. So next up, what is the point of demarcation in the Oilers' window of contention? And I have said it's the Zach Hyman signing. I would listen to the Matthias Ekholm trade. I think those are the two most significant moves that got the Oilers from playoff team to Stanley Cup contender, because you gave the Oilers a top six winger in Hyman who should be good for 30 goals flat up, just straight up, period. And then you have Ekholm who unlocks Bouchard, and Bouchard is a conduit. You play those three with McDavid, and it unlocks another level of play from those guys. It puts everyone in a better position when you have one of these great offensive play-driving defensemen, and they can't maximize what they're good at without the right complementary partner. And Ekholm, for all of the struggles he had in the Stanley Cup final this past year, by and large, he has been probably the Oilers' most consistent defenseman since getting here. He has been a very calming force, especially in his own end. He's got a little bit of an offensive flair to his game, occasionally can chip in a goal, scored, I think, 9 this past year. That's a good hockey player. You need guys like that if you're going to win the Stanley Cup. And when they unlock other parts of other people's games, that's what makes them so valuable. When you have a Matthias Ekholm that does the dirty work, that goes to the corners, that wins loose pucks, that absorbs forechecks, he's the one who gets the pucks to Bouchard, who lets Bouchard do all the fancy stuff that unlocks the Oilers' danger, especially at 5-on-5, because him and McDavid overlap so much. We did an episode a few weeks ago, probably sometime in June, if I had to guess, actually, about the impact Bouchard has on McDavid's minutes, especially in the postseason, how vital it is that those two overlap to really maximize the offensive output this team can put together. Okay. You know what? We're going to take a break right now because the next question has 3 parts, and that's going to take a while. And then we still have 3 more after that. All right. We're going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to dive into some draft misses. We're going to talk about, can McDavid and Draisaitl catch Crosby and Malkin, and so much more. Be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. I know in the dead of summer, we're just looking for crumbs of hockey. I know a lot of content people, I know a lot of full-time people are taking their breaks this time of year. I know a lot of the websites, a lot of the big publications, their hockey writers are kind of taking their brief reprieve. You know, the hockey calendar is brutal on everyone. Of course, you know, I'm not playing in the games. I only have to talk into a camera. This is not bad at all. I genuinely love doing this, especially when we can do things like today's episode. So continuing on the conversation, and this is really one that'll stick with you. And this is a fun exercise always, because we all love to talk about the draft. We all participate in fantasy football drafts. We all do drafts in the various sports video games, whether it's 2K and you do a historical one and you try and get Jordan and Shaq on the same team. If you do a Madden one, do you load up on offense? Do you load up on non-skill position guys and then win on efficiency? If you do an MLB one, fantasy drafts are so fun and so interesting because they tell you a lot about how people think. And I think the NHL draft often is one of the great windows into how hockey executives think. And I have 3 written down. There are definitely other ones we could do. First up, I have Nail Yakupov. The 3 next most likely guys you would take in that spot. And that's not a great draft, to be fair. Yakupov's draft class is not particularly awe-inspiring. It's not 2015. It's not 2016. It's okay. You know, there are high-end guys, and real simple. Would you rather have Philip Forsberg or Tomas Hertl? I think if the Oilers draft Tomas Hertl there, they probably don't end up getting him to his ceiling. I don't think, frankly, Tomas Hertl is going to reach his ceiling. I think at this point, he's had a lot of injuries. He's a little bit on the older side. And look, I know we're talking about drafts that are more than 10 years ago now. But I do think that anytime you can do these exercises and think about the process, how you got there, Yakupov had the really good World Juniors. He had the flair, and it just didn't gel. Yakupov might go down as the last true first overall bust. I know people, aren't particularly high on Alexis Lafreniere, but Alexis Lafreniere is going to be in the NHL for the next 10 years. Now Yakupov hung around for like 6 and then dipped to Europe. I think Yakupov probably goes down as the last NHL draft bust of the modern era, just because we're kind of weeding out these processes. And look, there's always room for error. We always talk about how environment matters almost as much, if not more than, frankly, talent does. So I think that's an example. I think you probably take Forsberg in that spot. Next up, Darnell Nurse. Instead of Darnell Nurse, the Oilers could have taken Jake Guentzel, Bo Horvat, or Josh Morrissey. Now, if you just want to go position for position, Josh Morrissey, think about how good a Josh Morrissey-Evan Bouchard pair would be right now. Think about how having 2 Norris Trophy caliber defensemen on the same team playing together. You think about what Taze and Makar do. And look, I think Devon Taze is probably a smidge better than Josh Morrissey, but I think that's close. And obviously Makar is better than Bouchard, but you have that level of talent at your disposal. You can play them together. You can split them up. If you want to play devil's advocate and say, well, no, they go get a scoring winger. Okay. You drop Guentzel on a line with McDavid or Draisaitl. You look what Guentzel was able to do with Sidney Crosby, 40-goal seasons, clutch playoff performer. Guentzel, but frankly, doesn't get enough credit for being a really good playoff player. And you think about how much that would have helped. Maybe you don't need to go get Zach Hyman and you can spend that money elsewhere because you've had Jake Guentzel for the previous number of seasons. You have those bona fide goal scorers. And then the last one, this one really stings because instead of Jesse Puljujarvi, you could have taken Matthew Tkachuk. You could have taken Clayton Keller, Charlie McAvoy, Mikhail Sergachev. If you take Sergachev, even if you take Sergachev, who is the worst of those 4 guys, that is still a fringe top like 20-25 defenseman in the whole league. You get Tkachuk in here, who I think is a top 20 player in the league. You get McAvoy in here, who's a top, I would say, 10 defenseman in the NHL, though I think a lot of people are kind of bearish on him after the last year and change up in Boston, the way things have gone. I think McAvoy is a franchise-altering defenseman. I think he's probably better than Evan Bouchard, though Bouchard has more offensive instincts. McAvoy's a little bit more well-rounded. I think there's a strong argument that if you drop Matthew Tkachuk on this team, if you drop Clayton Keller, even if you drop just McAvoy, you are talking about a team that's probably ahead of schedule in like 2020. I think the Oilers make that transition from fringe team to bubble team to serious contender probably a year sooner. I think that 2021 season where they lose to the Jets in the first round, I think there's a reasonable argument that if you have Matthew Tkachuk or Clayton Keller on that team, the Oilers take a step sooner. And look, maybe Matthew Tkachuk does the same thing. I don't want to be in Calgary. I don't want to be in Edmonton. It's perfectly possible he would have told the Oilers, no, I don't really have interest in signing. I want to be traded. And the Oilers lose the Tkachuk trade and the Panthers go on to win the Stanley Cup anyway. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but I do think Matthew Tkachuk is a franchise-altering player. I think Clayton Keller is right on the precipice of that. I think Keller's probably a top 40, maybe 50 player in the NHL. I got to start working on my NHL 100 list for when I do these conversations, so I have the rankings on the top of my head. And then Sergachev and Bouchard would be very fun together. Charlie McAvoy, you probably wouldn't play him and Bouchard on the same pair. But then again, if you have Charlie McAvoy, maybe Evan Bouchard doesn't get to his ceiling because there's not opportunity. Maybe Charlie McAvoy is playing alongside Oscar Klefbom or Darnell Nurse or Duncan Keith, and that really alters the trajectory because I think McAvoy is really good, but maybe McAvoy is more of a 60, 70-point guy if he's playing with McDavid and Draisaitl as opposed to in Boston where under Bruce Cassidy and Jim Montgomery, there's such an emphasis on defense and responsibility that they end up not getting as much offense. Their power play hasn't been as good the last couple of years, and it puts them in a weird spot. Okay, next question. Let's say the Oilers can't agree to a contract extension with Connor McDavid, and he tells them, I would like to be traded. You have until the trade deadline to work this out. I will agree to sign with wherever you trade me to, as long as I approve. And for me, there are 2 answers. Number one, if we're going for quantity of assets, as much as we can get, and he's good to go, we are trading him to the Montreal Canadiens. We are getting Nick Suzuki. We are getting Lane Hudson. We are getting Jakub Dobyshev. And we are getting Juraj Slafkovsky. And we are getting several draft picks. Yes, that is a lot. That is a future Norris Trophy caliber defenseman. That is a elite number 2 center, good number 1 center in Suzuki. Slafkovsky should be a 20 or 30 goal guy. And Dobyshev should be at least a backup goalie in the NHL. That is a lot. Connor McDavid is the best hockey player on the planet. The alternative, if you really want to call it that, and I don't think you would make out nearly as well doing this, you would need to do a superstar for superstar. You would need to do something along the lines of McDavid for Austin Matthews and stuff. McDavid for, I wouldn't even say Jack Eichel, and you wouldn't do McKinnon if you were if you were the Avalanche, you wouldn't trade Nathan McKinnon for Connor McDavid. I don't think the perceived improvement there would be worth the plus assets you would need to give up. Sure, you might be able to get the number a little more manageable, blah, blah, blah. I think realistically, you are talking about either the bundle of young stuff from Montreal. Maybe there's a Jason Robertson, Dallas, Jason Robertson, Rope Hintz type deal with stuff. But I think the best value you would get would be the bundle of young things. And look, that would be incumbent upon the Oilers knowing how to maximize those guys. And as we've discussed a lot on this episode, the Oilers don't have a great track record of turning guys over. Okay. Next question. Who would help the Oilers out the most right now? Dylan Holloway, Philip Broberg, Warren Foegele, Connor Brown, Corey Perry. I think it's Dylan Holloway. As much as I like Broberg, I really like Foegele. Foegele had a really good season in LA. Brown and Perry played nice roles on the team this past season that went back to the final. I think it's Dylan Holloway. I think if Dylan Holloway has another season last year in the top 6, we're talking about, can he get to that 25, 30 goal mark now, 3-4 years into an NHL career? Can he take that leap from nice supporting cast member to someone you can genuinely depend on? And you wouldn't have to have made that Ike Howard trade, or you'd be playing Ike Howard in a more defined role, whereas now the winger spots are a little bit more wide open. Maybe you don't need to go get Mangiapane. You could spend that money on a goalie. There are a lot of these hypotheticals, these ifs, ands, or buts. Okay. Next up. Can Connor McDavid hit the 2,000 point mark? And I did the math. So Connor McDavid has 1,082 points in 10 seasons. He's played 712 games. The games doesn't matter as much, but I did the math. So if McDavid wants to get there reasonably and have a real chance, he's 28 right now. If we're going to say he's going to play 8 more seasons, he plays till at least 36 years old, he would need to average 113, 112 points a season for the next 8 to 9 years to hit 2,000. I don't think that's happening. I think it's perfectly reasonable for him to probably settle into the 90s and then subsequently the 80s, very similar to the trajectory we've seen from Sidney Crosby the last couple of years, where I think McDavid will still be a point per player game into his mid to late 30s, but I don't think 110, 120 points is particularly realistic for a player into their mid to late 30s. So I think I did the math. He would need about 870, 880 points to get to that 2,000 point threshold. He's a great, this is the best hockey player I've ever seen. That's just a really high bar. I don't know. Next, can Connor McDavid and Sidney Crosby, can Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl catch Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin in points? McDavid and Draisaitl have 2,038 combined. Crosby and Malkin have 3,033. They're about 1,000 points apart, 2,995. I think this is more likely to happen than McDavid hitting 2,000. I think 2 guys for 1,000 points, they need 500 each. 500 each is a lot more doable. I think you could realistically see both those guys getting that before they're really out of their primes. And look, you have injuries for Sid. He lost like 2.5, 3 seasons in there. You lost half a season for a lockout, a quarter of a season from a pandemic, quarter of a season for another pandemic. So I think there's a reasonable chance McDavid and Draisaitl catch Sid and Malkin. I think the accomplishments, I think that's probably not happening. It'd be pretty hard for the Oilers to win 3 cups between now and McDavid Draisaitl retiring. But counting stats wise, I do think that's doable. Okay. We have 2 more questions. Second to last one. Will Connor McDavid sign for more or less than 4.5 years? I think it's under. I think he signs for exactly 4 years. I think if he signs for 5, he's doing the Oilers a massive favor. I think he'd be better off signing for 4 if I were him. Last question. Will the Oilers win a Stanley Cup with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl? So my heart says yes. The math says no. You go to 2 Stanley Cup finals and lose, you probably don't get back to a third one, just based on the probabilities, how infrequently that happens. But I think anytime you have 2 of the 5 best players in the world on the same team, you are dangerous. I still talk myself into the Penguins as recently as last year being at least a playoff team just because of how much reverence I have for Sid, for Malkin. You throw Erik Karlsson and Chris Letang in there. That's a pretty good foundation of a team. You lose Guentzel, and you're slowly going to watch that team unwind. But I could have seen the Oilers I could see the Oilers either going in that direction, or more optimistically, you hope they go in the Washington direction where they find that next wave of guys to be the Dylan Strome and the Rasmus Sandin, the way Washington, Connor McMichael, Alexei Protas, the way Washington has managed to sustain John Carlson and Alex Ovechkin into their mid to late 30s. That'll do it for these 20 questions about the Edmonton Oilers. Thank you so much to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you've got your team covered every day. Subscribe if you're over on Apple or Spotify. Leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get notifications whenever new content goes live. Let me know your answers to the questions. I'll put the questionnaire in the comments in the description for the video. You can answer if you'd like. I'd love to get some feedback. I love doing these open-ended questions because they really could go anywhere. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night, where they are previewing all 32 teams ahead of the 2025-2026 NHL season. I will see you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.